Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, we warned you this was coming. In fact, we're going to talk about two things today that we warned was coming. One, two successive events as one follows the other. But back in the beginning of this year, I offered my thoughts on what I thought were the most probable big global shock events to take place. And one of those was a currency collapse. And I think there will be many nations that see their currency collapse and become essentially worthless. But there was one nation in particular that we pointed to that would be leading the pack. And that nation was Japan. And we may be on the verge of seeing that take place. So I want to take a look at this right here. This is a list of this just has the top 12 countries. I don't know why they picked the top 12 countries specifically, but the top countries in terms of their indebtedness relative to GDP, or gross domestic product. So GDP measures the total output of your economy, all the economic activity that's taking place, and measures your debt load relative to that. So the higher the number, the worse off you are financially. The lower the number, the better off you are financially. And so here we see leading the pack in the world is Venezuela at 350%. And as we all know, Venezuela has experienced hyperinflation. It's really a very poor economy that people want to flee because of the communist socialist takeover in that country. But here at number 2, we have Japan at 266% of GDP. It's a very high number for an economy that's, depending on whether you count the European Union collectively as an economy, I do, that would make Japan the 4th largest economy behind the EU, the United States, and China. If you just measure the individual states in the European Union, then Japan is the 3rd largest economy in the world. But to have an economic power like Japan, to have a debt to GDP ratio this high, is really, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but it's extremely unusual. And this could lead to a global currency crisis, a financial crisis, because mathematically, there's really no way out of this problem. They've painted themselves into a corner with this. And we'll talk at the end of this, because if you look at this, there's some other nations in here that stand out. We talked about the EU being one of the largest economies. Well, here we have Greece on the list, we have Italy on the list, and we have Portugal on the list. All of those are EU member nations. And then, of course, we have the United States on the list as well. So we'll talk about that toward the end and what it means for those countries as well, because Japan, as I said, is leading the pack, but they certainly aren't the only ones who have found themselves in this situation. So what is the situation? Well, let's take a look at this right here. This is from CNBC. It says Japan 10-year Treasury. So this is essentially when Japan issues debt. They issue it in terms of, just like the United States, and all of these different durations. So in this case, the duration is 10 years. They're basically saying, if you lend us, 100 yen, we will, for 10 years, we'll pay that 100 yen back at the end of the 10 years, plus whatever interest rate we've promised you, which in this case is 0.88%. That's where it stands right now. What a bargain, right? So you lend 100 yen to the nation of Japan, and 10 years later, they'll pay you back 100.88 yen. Or if that was dollars, it would be $100.88. So you get 88 cents interest for risking your $100, putting that up for 10 years. What a great deal, right? But guys, it was even worse than this for years prior. I want to take a look at this chart. Goes back 5 years, but look at this back in the third quarter of 2019, you were looking at somewhere between a quarter to almost, 0.24 to negative 2.4 to negative 2.9% interest. So in this case, hey, we're going to lend you 100 yen, and at the end of 10 years, you get 99.7 back. So you're paying them for the privilege of lending them what you think is money, but guys, it's just worthless government currency, as we see. So, but because that doesn't even account for the inflation and the fact that 100 yen 10 years from now isn't going to buy what 100 yen today buys. So why is this? Who in their right mind would lend yen to the Japanese government at negative interest, much less, 0.88% for 10 years? Well, the answer is no one, right? And so you would go, well, how is it that they can issue all of this government debt at these interest rates? Well, what happens is it's a giant Ponzi scheme, guys. They issue this debt, and then the Bank of Japan, which is the central bank of Japan, it is responsible for issuing the yen. They come out. It's the equivalent of the U.S. Federal Reserve in the United States, or let's say the European Central Bank in Europe, in the European Union. And so they go in and they say, well, we're going to, we don't want this debt to float in the marketplace because the interest rates people are going to demand are too high, because they know that we have this debt to GDP ratio of 266%, and that, they're not likely to get paid back, and that's very risky to loan us this yen. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep those rates from going up, because if we had to pay the real interest, whatever that may be, well, then it would eat up all of the tax revenue in Japan just to pay the interest. And we would essentially see Japan default on its debt. What would that mean for the global marketplace? We'll talk about that in a moment. But so what they've done is they said, well, we're going to go in and we're going to buy that government debt. We're going to buy it to keep the rates low, right? What a great idea. So exactly how do they do that? Well, they print yen, and then they go and buy the debt. And so you may be thinking, what they do what now? They issue debt, and then they buy it back with printed pieces of paper. That's exactly what they're doing. You and I would call this a Ponzi scheme or a scam. Yet this is what central banks all over the world are doing and have been doing for quite some time. And so in order to keep their debt from running away and absolutely collapsing the economy of Japan, they've been trying to keep the interest expense on their debt low by buying back these government bonds with printed yen. And then recently they've noticed, well, people are demanding more and more interest. It became clear a couple of years ago. And so we started to see these rates tick up. And so they said, well, we're going to cap the rate that's paid at 0.25%, right? 0.25%. So don't even think about trying to demand a higher rate than that. As soon as it hits 0.25%, we're going to come in, we're going to buy it all back up, right? So that's what they started doing. Well, the market had other ideas. So we see that, here in July, or no, last year. So this is about this time last year, they said, well, because they were starting to accumulate a large portion of the Japanese government debt. Maybe we're going to hold fast at 0.5%, right? 0.5%. So we saw them change that hard line, that red line they had drawn from 0.25 to zero point 0.5, and we saw it go up. We saw a little dip following the bank failures back in March, where you had the second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in U.S. history. So a little bit of a miniature crisis that lasted a couple of weeks until the Federal Reserve came in and bailed that out or papered over everything, all the problems. And then, in July they said, you know what, maybe not 0.5, 1%. If these rates go above 1%, we're going to buy up everything that there is. And so we've seen them go up to where they are today. And now there's speculation, maybe it's going to be a little bit higher than 1%, right? So in other words, the marketplace, whatever is left of that free market, is demanding higher interest rates. We're at a point now where the Bank of Japan owns 45% of all of the outstanding Japanese government debt. So they've bought back almost half of the debt they've issued by simply printing yen and buying it back. Again, you and I would call that a Ponzi scheme. We'd call it a scam. People would be you and I would be arrested if we went out into the free market and tried to do this. We would get arrested and put in jail, probably for the rest of our lives. But these are central bankers, so they get away with this stuff. But they won't get away with it forever, because if they keep doing this, eventually they'll own all of the debt, and the currency will go into hyperinflation because no one will be loaning anything to the government. They'll simply be just printing the yen in order to spend, which is essentially what they've been doing anyway. But what happens when we see them going in there and buying all this stuff? Well, let's take a look over here. This is a look at the US dollar to Japanese yen exchange rate. And as we can see, this says that there's approximately 150 yen for every dollar. But if we look back to when all of this started, it was, 103, 105 yen per dollar. So we're seeing the purchasing power of the yen. We're seeing the yen lose purchasing power, which means this is very inflationary. And keep in mind, when we say, okay, 2 years ago, what cost 100 yen now cost 150 yen. Well, that's relative to the dollar, which is also losing its purchasing power and experiencing inflation. So this is even worse than it looks on the surface. They're about to lose control of the currency. Plain and simple. They're in a place where if they continue to buy this debt, they will destroy the currency. The currency will hyperinflate and become worthless, just as we saw in Weimar Germany, just as we've seen recently in Zimbabwe. And so it will be a total currency collapse. But if they say, we're going to defend the yen, we're going to raise rates, we're not going to allow this to happen, we're going to stop buying this government debt and let the rates free float, then you see those rates go to 2%, 3%, 4%. Many analysts say once it gets to 4%, all of the tax revenue in Japan would be completely eaten up by interest payments. Right now, we're already at a quarter of all Japanese tax revenue goes just to pay the interest on their national debt. And so, of course, once we see all of this happen, it's just a mathematical certainty that we're going to see a collapse. They either have to default on the debt or hyperinflate away their currency. Either one of those scenarios leads to a major financial crisis, because again, we're talking about one of the largest economies in the entire world tied in with all the other economies. We live in a connected global economy. So we're looking at a major financial crisis that will occur once it becomes clear that the Bank of Japan has completely lost control of the situation. And so that's one of the things that we warned about at the beginning of the year. But what did we also warn about continuously last year and this year, and saying with this inflation, what do the politicians always do? Well, they say, we said that they would say, oh, well, inflation is so bad. People can't afford gasoline. They can't afford rent. They can't afford groceries. So we need to have special subsidies. We need to have stimulus checks that we're going to provide. We're going to give everybody, $1,000 a month to pay for their groceries because it's terrible that people can't afford groceries. And of course, what's that going to do but simply drive up the cost of those groceries? And then they'll turn around and say, well, now everybody needs $2,000 a month, and then it becomes $4,000 and $8,000 and on and on and on. So what is Japan's solution for this problem, this crisis that they see coming? Well, it's exactly that, as we see here in this AP story. It says Japan's prime minister announces $113 billion in stimulus spending. So, hey, what do you do when your government is spending more than it has? Well, spend some more, right? So where they're going to get this, who knows, because they have to borrow it and then turn around and print to buy it back. Again, at some point, the world figures out this is a shell game, this is a scam, and it's over. And when that happens, it's going to have a major impact on the global economy. So it says Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced Thursday a stimulus package of more than 17 trillion yen, that's 113 billion US dollars, that includes tax breaks and benefits for low-income households, a plan criticized by some observers as populist spending that would worsen Japan's national debt. Yeah, it's going to do that. It's going to destroy the currency. It's going to be terrible. It says Kishida said his priorities are to overcome deflation, and they have had a deflation problem for several decades. That is about to be overcome in a major turning point toward maybe hyperinflation. We're going to see, but at the very least, it's going to be massive inflation. And to put the economy on a growth track, tax revenues will increase only when the economy grows and lead to fiscal health, he told a news conference, explaining the package endorsed by his cabinet earlier in the day. And I love this sentence here. The government will fund the spending by compiling a supplementary budget of 13.1 trillion yen, or $87 billion for the current fiscal year. I'm not really sure how that funds the spending. I mean, you and we could come up with a budget, and I could say, you know what, I want to spend $200 million next month, and write that down on a piece of paper, and I can call it a supplementary budget. But that doesn't mean it's funded. I don't have $200 million. So I'm struggling to figure out how exactly this funds the spending because you simply compile something, right? Are they raising taxes? No. So how exactly are they doing this? Well, they're just going to print it up, right? Just going to print it up, which of course is going to lead to more inflation. Let's get some of these details in here. It says the package includes a temporary tax cut of $266 per person from next June and $465 payouts to low-income households, as well as subsidies for gasoline and utility bills. So again, this is going to mean inflation of utility bills and higher gasoline prices, because your supply stays the same, but now the demand goes up because you're artificially increasing demand by handing currency to people. And what are they going to do, especially if they're low-income households? Well, they're going to use that to go out and buy gasoline and pay their utility bills, and it's going to lead to further inflation. So guys, this is another one we warned about. This is a bad thing because we are on the verge of seeing the largest sovereign debt and currency crisis in the history of the world. And I'm not talking about simply Japan, I'm talking about pretty much the entire world, because again, we pointed out before, Japan is not alone. Japan is probably the worst off of these major industrialized nations. But we looked at this list earlier with Greece and Italy and Portugal. And if you'll remember, there was a Greek debt crisis back in 2010 where there was this big discussion, Greece is going to default, they're going to break up the European Union, all these terrible things are going to happen, and then it just sort of went away. There was talk of some bailouts. It went away. Why did that happen? How did that happen? And we saw in 2011 there were similar issues surrounding Italy, Portugal, Spain, and other nations within the European Union. So what happened? Well, the European Central Bank simply printed euros and bought the debt issued by these countries, the same as the Bank of Japan has been doing, that led to this and the current predicament they now find themselves in. So they're just a little bit ahead of the European Union, but the European Union is running down the same path, and it's going to get particularly harder for them now that we're seeing energy costs rise because they're having to import liquefied natural gas. They're no longer getting the cheap energy they once received from Russia. And of course, here we see the United States down here too, doing the same thing. Something like 20% of the U.S. national debt is held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve simply printed dollars and bought the debt. So we're seeing central banks all around the world running the scam. And at some point, it comes to an end and unravels in a bad way. Now, historically, people have pointed out, I think it's something like 82% of nations in the last 200 years, or there have been 82 nations in the last couple hundred years that have had a debt to GDP ratio of over 130%. And in 81 of those 82 cases, it led to a default of the debt. The only one case where it hasn't happened, or it didn't happen, however you want to see it, is Japan today. So it just hasn't happened yet. But the point is, once you get to that number of 130% debt to GDP, mathematically it becomes impossible to get out of that predicament. And again, where do we see the United States right now? Right on the threshold of that. We see the nations of the world with these fiat currencies, these fake currencies. They simply print and spend what they want to. They don't worry about tax revenue. They don't worry about the debt because they know they can just print more of their currency and hand it out. But that's going to lead to inflation and eventually hyperinflation as they try to avoid outright defaulting on their debt. And guys, this is going to cause a massive financial crisis because we live in a world where there's $2 quadrillion of derivatives built into the financial system. Warren Buffett called these weapons of mass financial destruction, right? And so we're going to see a lot of that unravel as we see either the hyperinflation of the end or a default on Japanese debt. That will soon be followed by the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, virtually every nation in the world, because all the nations in the world use fiat currencies. And when you see this ripple effect, this financial contagion take hold, and they're staring down the barrel of a financial depression, a crisis worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s, the response will be exactly what we're seeing in Japan. It will be to print currency and hand it out to all the citizens to try to buy off their votes, to try to keep from having riots in the streets. We're going to print this and hand it out and hyperinflate away everything and disintegrate the entire system. The monetary system we have in the world today is failing. It has come to an end. We are in the last desperate gasp of life of this system. You might say that the system is moving toward a great reset. It's coming. What do you think they have in mind and the power centers of the world for that great reset? What will they What could possibly stabilize things afterward? What will desperate people who need to feed themselves and their families be willing to do? Would they accept something like, say, a central bank digital currency, a programmable currency that surveils every activity you undertake and gives complete power to the government? I think the answer is yes. Of course, the book of Revelation tells us that one day there will be such a system in place globally that gives the Antichrist and the false prophet the ability to control who can buy and who can sell. And we see these central bank digital currencies all over the world today. I think it's around 95% of the countries have some sort of program in place, whether the phase is a research phase or an actual launch phase that's out in the open being used right now. But what happened? It's very clear that platform is being put in place. The infrastructure is being put in place. They want to roll it out. The only question is, well, how do we get people to accept it? How do we get people to start using it? How do we get people to turn to this from the current system that they're using? Well, when there is no alternative, or at least people think there is no alternative, they will turn to that. Because when the system collapses and people are in desperate need, they will turn, unfortunately, to the government as their savior rather than Jesus Christ. Guys, what's the timeline for all of this unfolding? I don't know. But again, it's a mathematical certainty that we will see all of this take place. What can't be paid back won't be paid back. So, guys, we warned about this and we're seeing this now. We're seeing the Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, losing control of this Ponzi scam that they've been running, where they're buying back the debt, trying to push rates down. They call it yield curve control. They're trying to push the interest rates on their debt down so that it doesn't just spiral out of control exponentially. But they're getting to the point where we're going to buy up all of our debt and hyperinflate the currency away. So they're trying to back off from that, and they keep drawing a new red line in the sand, right? It's a quarter of a point. That's the red line. Oh, no, it's half a point. That's the red line. Oh, it's 1%. That's the line. They keep moving the line. It's a sign, guys, that they're losing control. And once they do, I shudder to think what the financial markets around the world are going to do. And with what's going on in the world right now, another event could trigger this in a very short period of time. Imagine if there's a oil embargo from Gulf states against Western nations like the United States, like Japan. Japan imports 90% of its fossil fuels. They're in dire need of energy. Energy is how you run an economy. If there were an oil embargo, we would see this break immediately after that's happened. We would see a major financial crisis globally. So all of this it's like a house of cards ready to fall at any moment. So again, we've talked about making sure that you're prepared as you can be for when this takes place. I hope the rapture of the church occurs and we're not here, but who knows if we will be when this happens. But going into every Friday, I would make sure that I had a full tank of gas, a big deep pantry, and that I'm ready for the banking system, the financial system, to essentially be closed for a week or 2 weeks while they sort things out, because we could see the global financial system freeze as a result of a collapse like this in the Japanese yen, or any number of things we haven't even thought of. So, guys, all of this is just another sign of the times in which we live and the global scale problems that we're dealing with. These are, I believe, birth pains that we're witnessing, because every time we turn around, we see something new that's taking place. So let me know what your thoughts all are. Leave your comments below. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. And God willing, I will see you on Wednesday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.